everything used as evidence for evolution has been proven wrong.
Of course, the preacher hasn't disproved any evidence of evolution. He dismisses the work of generations of biologists that use evolution to this day in favor of his own wacky conclusions, while science moves on without him. He thinks he can dismiss their work as a lie just because he doesn't want to believe it. It's so simple to ignore and dismiss evidence with a childish rhyme like goo to you. It's another thing to understand the real science that this preacher parodies. But let's go through the list of things he thinks he's disproved and that I have corrected in earlier episodes of the series. On point number 1, the preacher recited the spillover hypothesis, proposed by a geographer rather than a geologist. And the point is not that the spillover hypothesis has been discredited by other scientists, but rather that the guy who proposed it said that this would be the way in which the Colorado River carved the Grand Canyon over a period of 5 million years. So the preacher's own source says he's wrong about this. As for the rest, we've barely begun to show all the ways that the geologic column really does show Earth's history. The preacher never admits the fact that radiometric dating provides absolute dates objectively, regardless of index fossils. And of course he wants to reject index fossils too, pretending that they're in a random and meaningless assortment. But we all know better than that, and I think he does too. He's also been shown the evidence of plant and animal relationships, though he doesn't understand it, and his audience won't understand it either if they listen to him. He still says that evolution isn't what all the textbooks say it is, and he has been corrected on this countless times. He says that natural selection isn't a factor in evolution, but he contradicted himself when he explained how it works and unwittingly described an evolutionary process. He almost never refers to actual science publications. Instead, he cites distortions of science written by other creationists like himself. So he repeated a conspiracy theory that the peppered moth experiment was faked, when we know it really wasn't, and subsequent studies prove that. Comparative anatomy really does confirm evolutionary relationships and doesn't show any hint that his magical designer even could have been involved. Human embryos really do have pharyngeal slits, and evolution provides the only explanation as to why those exact same structures go on to become gills in fish. The fetus is human, but no one ever said it wasn't. What other species would it be? And he would have had a point about the appendix not being vestigial, but that doesn't count as a lie in the textbooks because once a function was found, the textbooks were changed accordingly. We still have plenty of other vestigial features that I've already listed, and the existence of the appendix is still evidence of evolution, albeit of a different sort than previously thought. Snakes do have vestigial legs, as was made obvious in the fossils shown in the previous episode. And some whales had not just a pelvis, but legs too, and some of them could even walk. And the human tailbone is an embryological vestige of our evolutionary development. So no, he never disproved any of the evidence for evolution. And lest we forget, no argument or evidence for creationism has ever been proven right. All they have or ever had were frauds, falsehoods, and fallacies, and never anything more than that. There's never been even one legitimate point that was both true and supportive of creationism. Ever.
If real evidence exists, I'd like to see it.
I myself have personally showed this preacher plenty of evidence of evolution during our debate. He was supposed to address each of those videos live with his followers in the audience, but when it came to these 3 videos, the ones where I presented my 3 lines of evidence listed in the beginning, the 3 points that the whole debate was supposed to be about, he failed to show any of those to his followers. I think because he knew there was no way he could contest what I said or showed there, nor could he ever admit any of that without bringing an end to his ministry. So instead, he ended the debate there, without covering those like he promised he would. So he has seen evidence of evolution, but he does not like to see it.
We'll pay $250,000 for real proof for evolution.
Remember that this challenge was a bait and switch, wherein he was offering someone else's money. And when you click the link to collect that $250,000, you would then see where he says he doesn't want and will not accept evidence of evolution. Instead, he changed the rules so that now he wants you to prove that God couldn't have created everything, while his challenge also requires that you assume that his God exists. The challenge was structured in such a way that there was no way for anyone to present evidence of evolution, and he would simply deny it if you tried. As we've seen all throughout this series, the preacher will never acknowledge any evidence of evolution or anything else that contradicts his position.
But don't lie to me.
This preacher is telling us not to lie to him. I won't, because I think the truth matters more than whatever we might rather believe. If you want to know the truth of evolution, I'll show you how to know it. But the only truth to creationism is that there is no truth to it. You shouldn't say that something is true until or unless you can show the truth of it, the evidence to back it up. It is dishonest to assert baseless speculation as though it were a matter of fact, pretending to know what no one even can know. But yet that's what all religions do. Only in faith-based belief systems are unsupported assertions of impossible absurdities referred to as revealed truth on the alleged authority of subjective impressions, or even something as vacuous as a dream. Then, as if that wasn't bad enough already, religious apologetics is the practice of making up excuses to rationalize or justify theological contradictions and inconsistencies, or to systematically dismiss without consideration any and all evidence against the preferred assumption. Creationism is a form of religious extremism that requires denial of reality, in whole or in part, at least of evolution specifically, as well as scientific methodology. Instead, you're told to believe in supernatural miracles that can only be assumed on faith in lieu of any actual factual evidence. You're told that you better believe it just because someone told you to, or else you'll be tortured forever, which is already evidence that it isn't really true.
I think you ought to demand that your school board cut out pages with lies on them. Don't put up with that stuff. I was speaking at University of West Florida, and this one biology teacher said, "Hovind, I don't think we should deface textbooks." I said, "What do you mean?" He said, "Well, tonight you said we should cut out the pages with this stuff on it. We shouldn't deface a textbook." I said, "Well, sir, suppose you were teaching math and you found a book that said 2 + 2 is 5. What would you tell your students to do?" He said, "I would tell them to mark out the wrong answer and write in the right answer." You would deface a textbook?
If somewhere within the Bible I were to find a passage that said 2 + 2 = 5, I wouldn't question what I'm reading in the Bible. I would believe it, accept it as true, and then do my best to work it out and to understand it.
I said, "Now, sir, you teach biology, don't you?" He said, "Yes, I do." I said, "Well, suppose you found one of your textbooks that taught the embryo has gill slits, or the snake has a vestigial pelvis, or, all this stuff I covered tonight. Are you going to tell your kids to tear that page out?" He said, "Oh, no, no." I said, "Would you tell them to mark it out and then write something in the column that it's not correct?" He said, "No, no, no." I said, "Would you at least put a warning sticker in the front cover that said, 'Hey, kids, the information on page 85 is wrong'? Would you at least warn them?" He said, "Oh, no, no." I said, "You would correct a math book, but you won't correct a biology book." I said, "You, sir, are a hypocrite. And the folks in this county need to help you get a different job picking peaches or changing tires. But you got no business taking our tax dollars to lie to these kids coming through your class. We're paying for this school. Why don't you be respectful and resign, or quit lying to the kids?" He said, "Hovind, you don't have much tact." Oh, I made full contact with that guy, that's for sure. Okay.
I don't believe this story ever happened. Certainly not all of it, not that way. I don't believe any of the preacher's stories. But the important thing here is that he thinks he's disproved all of these things in the textbooks just by disagreeing with them, as if the facts can be disputed not by contradictory facts, which he never presents, but merely by uttering the phrase, "I don't think so." The preacher simply proclaims that this or that is wrong, as if science is based on authoritarian proclamation, as if he had authority to speak on matters he doesn't even want to understand. Whenever there are errors in the textbooks, they are identified and corrected by experts, not by hucksters who don't even know what they're talking about.
Evolution is unproved and unprovable. We believe it because the only alternative is special creation. They just don't want to believe this.
Remember that, as we covered in a previous episode, there is no evidence that this person ever actually said that. And even if he did, it would still have been wrong. Science has a rule that you can never prove any theory to be true, because science refers to proof in the mathematics sense. So the theory of gravity, atomic theory, and the germ theory of disease are all just theories, right? Of course not. Each of them, and evolution true, are all facts as well, and they can all be proven in a colloquial sense by an overwhelming preponderance of evidence beyond reasonable doubt. We've already done that with evolution, and simultaneously, separately, we've also disproved creationism too.
They don't want to believe in creation.
We don't want to have to believe in anything. We want to know. and have some way to improve our understanding, even if that means admitting and correcting errors. And we want some way to be sure which changes would be corrections. That means we can't let ourselves believe anything on faith. It isn't about what we want to believe either. It's about whatever is supported by the evidence. And whatever is not supported doesn't warrant serious consideration. Come back when you've got something to show that there's at least a there. Until then, we have nothing to talk about. It doesn't matter what you believe. All that matters is why you believe it. What is the reason that compels you and that should compel us too? If you have no evidence, something we can at least test and confirm that actually indicates a potential for your conclusion to be true, then we have no reason to believe you. And having no reason to believe something is a pretty good reason not to believe it.
And they're willing to believe a lie rather than believe the truth.
Once again, the preacher is talking about himself here, projecting his own faults onto those who will not share them. He is the one that believes things that are not evidently true and that are evidently not true. And he is the one who refuses to accept or admit what really is true. And that's how creationism is. Several creationist organizations have published statements of faith wherein they unabashedly admit, as if this were something to be proud of, that they have already rejected all the evidence there could ever be if it contradicts their dogmatic interpretation of Scripture. There is not one thing that any religion exclusively teaches that qualifies as an actual fact. And I have repeatedly seen believers admit that they will deny whatever facts necessary to still believe what they want to believe anyway. When I offer to prove evolution to their satisfaction, believers refuse to engage in any Socratic dialogue that would cause them to admit certain facts against their preferred delusion. That happened again just last week when someone on the League of Reason forum said that they are creationists precisely because they deny the facts and evidence. I say this all the time, but the truth is what the facts are, what we can show to be true, not whatever else we might want to assume or imagine beyond or instead of that. If you don't care what the facts are, you don't care what the truth is. Now, that doesn't mean that there are no honest people who happen to believe in creationism. When everyone around you seems to believe that and you don't have an adequate education and know better, then you could be deceived by their relentlessly repeated pseudoscience propaganda, especially when that's all you've ever heard all your life since as far back as you can remember, and you've been psychologically conditioned to defend any attack against the belief as if it was an attack against yourself. But once sincere believers begin to investigate the evidence and arguments on either side of this alleged controversy, they will very quickly face a life-altering choice, whether to remain honest or whether to remain creationist, because it is no longer possible to be both. Either they can honestly concede what the definition of macroevolution really is and thus be forced to admit that it really has been observed, or they can lie and say that there's never been any transitional species or beneficial mutations. Way too often, I've seen people come to that crossroads and make the wrong choice. Sometimes, a few times, the faithful have even admitted to me that they're going to keep on believing whatever they want to believe, simply because they want to believe it, even if they already know that it's not really true. I've even got that admission too. So they admit that it is the creationists and not the evolutionists who are willing to believe a lie rather than risk understanding the actual truth,
just so they can support their wicked lifestyle.
A lot of preachers say this, but it is the stupidest argument I've ever heard for so many reasons. Think about it. The implication is that we secretly believe that a God exists, but we pretend that he doesn't because we want to sin, whatever that means. Even though the Bible and the Quran both say that all sins will be forgiven if we but believe, and the only sin that will not be forgiven in both religions is the sin of disbelief, which both scriptures say is a damnable evil. In both religions, the only way to guarantee damnation is if you don't believe in God, and merely believing in God is described as doing good. In either religion, your actual morality is largely irrelevant. All that really matters is whether you believe. It all comes down to whether you empower the clergy and give them 10% of your income. Nothing else you do matters more than that. In Christianity, you can keep on sinning and still be forgiven because every Christian is still an admitted sinner. So if you really love sin, whatever that means, then believe in God and sin all you want to. But if you really believe there's a God, yet you pretend that he doesn't exist just so that you can do bad things, That's just as stupid as pretending that if you can't see him, he can't see you. Imagine knowing that the FBI has you under surveillance, yet pretending that they don't so that you can still commit a bunch of crimes, giving them the evidence to bust you. You know that pretending they're not really there won't help you. You wouldn't do those things if you really thought that some form of law enforcement might be watching you, regardless whether it's the police or God. So if you're sinning anyway, whatever that means, or if you simply deny belief in God, either way, we have to assume that you really don't believe there's a God watching you, and that your disbelief in God has nothing to do with your allegedly wicked lifestyle. And what excuse do Christians have for their wicked lifestyle? The list of Christian criminals is long and sordid, but I note that Carl Sagan and Isaac Asimov and people of that sort were not out raping and killing, fighting and fornicating like so many Christians and Muslims do. Disbelief in God doesn't make you immoral, and believing in God doesn't make you moral. And sometimes we see the opposite indication. We see that when clergymen lose their religion, when they realize they no longer believe what they're preaching anymore, they report becoming less prejudiced and more tolerant. Whereas
the factions of dominant religion typically have the highest crime rate, with special emphasis on hate crimes. That'll come up later. Religious people are more likely to condone the murder or torture of prisoners, where non-religious people are more likely to consider that morally wrong. But it gets worse. Am I on the right one? Okay. The most religious countries also have the highest murder rate, and the same is true of the most religious areas within the United States. The higher the religiosity of a given populace, the higher the murder rate. Secular nations show the opposite tendencies, where the less religious they are, the more peaceful they tend to be. Here in America, I always forget I'm not in America. Evangelical Christians have the highest divorce rate. They also have the highest rates of teen pregnancy, which isn't surprising, since they think abstinence only is an appropriate way to deal with sex education. I live in Texas, where the abstinence only program has earned us the status of being the highest rate of repeat teen pregnancies. But it gets even worse. Fundamentalist Christians have a higher rate of abortions, a testament to their hypocrisy. This is what a colossal failure the policies of the religious right have always been. But it gets even worse than that. Child Protective Services and other agencies report a significant majority of child abusers and molesters identified as very religious, and the more religious they are, the worse offenders they are. Yet, religious people still argue that the less religious we are, the less moral we are, and that the more we abandon faith, the more violent we become, with the murder rates going up all the time. But that's not what's happening. And it doesn't take much research to see that. I found this on Wikipedia in a minute. And I couldn't find a larger version of this chart, so let's look at this one, depicting violent crime. And yeah, again, we're seeing the opposite trend to what believers think it should be, and the implication is dramatically against them. Now, you'll see a spike where it's on that 70.0 line for the last time. Where is that? That's 1981. And it suddenly plummets. I don't think Merle Haggard gets any credit for that. That's when all those heavy metal albums were released, along with the cartoon movie of the same name. Now, what was the best years for heavy metal? It was the first half of the 1980s, correlating with a dramatic reduction in violent crime. Coincidence? Well, maybe.
As I said in a previous episode, anyone who really uses the Bible as their exclusive moral guide would be a criminal in every country on this planet. But the preacher isn't even talking about whether we believe in God. He's talking about whether we reject the evidence of evolution to believe in a magical, miraculous creation instead. Ignoring the fact that many, if not most, other Christians around the world accept evolution, and not for any theological reason, but because evolution is a verifiable fact. You don't have to reject reality and believe in creationism to believe in God. But of course, biblical literalists don't understand that, or much of anything else. In fact, they think that fallacious arguments from ignorance and incredulity count as evidence against the things they don't understand.
Psalm 94 says, "He that formed the eye, shall he not see?" God formed the eye. Eyeballs are incredibly complicated.
Notice that the preacher gives no evidence in support of his empty assertion that God formed the eye, other than saying that the eye is complicated. Any pattern emerging from the molecular level will invariably be vastly more complex than we can perceive at our scale. But excessive complexity implies a haphazard, incidental design, while the hallmark of an intelligent designer would be an efficient simplicity, such as we do not see anywhere in biology or biochemistry.
Charles Darwin said, "To suppose that the eye could have been formed by natural selection seems, I freely confess, absurd." But then he goes on for 3 or 4 pages and says how he thinks it happened anyway.
I have to credit the preacher for admitting this, because creationists usually give the quote where Darwin says, "I know it sounds absurd," and they leave out where he continues, "but reason tells me." They usually don't mention that he went on for 4 more pages explaining the evidence that was already known in his day, nor do they admit that we know even more now.
Your eyeball's amazing. You know, at the back of your eye, there are 137 million light-sensitive cells in 1 square inch, called your retina. All of them wired straight to the brain. How would you like to hook up 137 million electrical connections in 1 square inch? My Heavenly Father did.
Note that, again, the preacher gives no reason to assume a designer, nor any reason to doubt evolution either. He thinks that big numbers mean intelligent design. But remember that cells are quite small, so a single cubic centimeter of cancer could contain 1 billion cells of melanoma. Does that inspire you to say hallelujah? How about the fact that some cancers are now contagious and can live independently outside of the body? Evolution explains that too, where intelligent design never explained anything.
He's pretty smart, isn't he?
A smart designer wouldn't waste effort making infinite manual adjustments on everything. Instead, he would devise a system to do all of that work automatically. And if he was really smart, that system would also be self-correcting. Again, we're given no reason to assume a God, unless you're just looking for any old excuse to believe what you already wanted to. But we do have that self-correcting system, which could have come about anyway as an inevitable result of an imperfect replication. So we didn't need a God for that.
Now, I debated one atheist one time, and he said, "Hovind, the eye is an example for evolution because it's poorly designed." I said, "What on earth are you talking about?" He said, "Well, the light comes into your eye, and then it goes through blood vessels in front of the retina." He said, "That's wired backwards." He said, "The octopus has a much better eye because their blood vessels are behind the retina." I said, "Sir, let me just explain something to you, okay?" I said, "We live in the air." Now, air is a pretty poor insulator for UV light. So your body is designed with the blood vessels in front of the retina. That's your body's last defense against ultraviolet light. Now, octopus live in the water. Okay? Water blocks UV light, so they don't need their blood vessels in front. See, we're designed for living in air, and they're designed for living in water. Now, if you want to swap eyes with an octopus, you just go ahead, sir, but you're going to be blind in a few days, okay? Because they don't have the blood vessels in front to block the UV light.
There is so much wrong with this. First of all, this site says that the crystalline lens of the eye absorbs UVA to help protect the retina. It doesn't say anything about blood vessels protecting the retina. In fact, it says that continuous absorption of UV light by the lens of the eye results in connective tissue breakdown and degenerative changes within the lens, and that blood vessels may be affected. How might they be affected? Well, this site says that doctors suspect that the blood vessels at the back of the eye are exposed to UV radiation. That might cause ocular melanoma. So the blood vessels are not there to protect the retina. Instead, they need to be protected from UV radiation by the lens, and they would be better protected if they were behind the retina, the way they are in the eyes of an octopus. So if you could trade your eyes with an octopus, you'd be better off, and you wouldn't have that blind spot that vertebrates have to compensate for with micro movements of the eyes that you're not even aware of. That is the flaw in the design of our eyes, and the preacher did not even attempt to address that at all.
What a dumb evidence for evolution. What they're trying to say is, well, God wouldn't do it this way, so it must have evolved. Well, that's a silly argument for evolution.
Remember also that the octopus is a mollusk, and mollusk eyes evolved independently from the eyes of chordates. Vertebrates are a subset of chordates. Thus, even though all vertebrates, reptiles, birds, amphibians, and mammals, breathe air, we inherited the basic structure of our eyes from fish. So why do fish eyes have those blood vessels in front of their retina if they
live in the water?
Shouldn't their eyes be designed the same as an octopus's eyes in that case? And likewise, remember that the preacher denies all the evidence that whales evolved from land mammals. He thinks they were specially created
for living in water.
So why do they too have the same eyes that all mammals do? Shouldn't God have given them octopus eyes as well, along with gills and a handful of other mods and fundamental structural revisions that they should have had if they were intelligently designed?
Maybe you just don't understand why it was designed that way.
Maybe there's no reason to imagine that it was deliberately designed. No, I don't mean maybe. There is no good reason to believe that. We do understand how evolution works, and that it works. But there is no indication that anything in biology was deliberately designed by any pre-human intelligence. That's just a fact. There's no evidence that there even could have been a designer.
I think man's understanding of the human body is about like putting a 5-year-old kid under the hood of your car and saying, hey kid, take out whatever this thing doesn't need. You don't know what any of it does. You can take it all out, right?
Likewise, I think that religion is what we get when we ask someone with the scientific competence of a 5-year-old how complex natural systems came to be. Of course, because the child has no idea, they would likely posit a magic invisible man.
You know, your eyeball's amazing. It would take a minimum of 100 years of Cray computer time to simulate what takes place in your eye many times every second.
That might have sounded impressive back in 1985, but it seems to me that now, in only a third of that time, much smaller compact computerized cameras can already compete with that and even exceed that without even having to wait for processing. And they can do it in 4 times greater resolution than our eyes can even see. And then you have to account for the fact that animals have dedicated neural connections and something equivalent to inbred algorithms for faster reactions, the sort of things we build into autonomous cars and such now. Not that we should compare computers to organisms, because they're hardly analogous.
Eyeballs are amazing. But this textbook says, the complex structure of the human eye may be the product of millions of years of evolution. Why doesn't God get the glory for what he did?
Because he evidently didn't do anything, and it would be dishonest to assert that he did without any evidence to back that up, or even to show that the assertion is based on anything more than mere imagination. You can't say things are true that are not evidently true just because you want them to be. That's called lying.
This textbook shows the kids a bird eye and a reptile eye, and it says right up here, boys and girls, you can better understand how the eye might have evolved if you picture a series of changes. You have to imagine how it happened.
Because a development that took hundreds of millions of generations cannot be replicated in only a matter of minutes. And students wouldn't have access to perform such experiments even if they could. Sometimes you have to explain how things work, which is something creationists never do.
Just imagine the eye changing. That's not science. Imagining how it happened. Where's the evidence?
Just reviewing the evidence, all that we have available, is already too much for just a few minutes. Remember that it took Darwin 4 pages just to explain what was already known in his time. And since then, the evolution of the eye has been well and thoroughly explained by countless sources citing several lines of evidence. Just Google it. There are lectures listing evidence all over the web. Seriously, this supposed mystery was already solved way back in Darwin's day. We got all the evidence you need, if you would accept evidence at all.
See, evolution only takes place in the imagination. Never takes place in reality.
Except that it happens all over reality, and our failure to understand that only makes it worse. Look at the evolution of COVID-19 and how our ignorance of evolution gave it the advantage of incubation when we failed to choke it out fast enough. And now there's the Delta variant, among many others, showing that we should have acted uniformly and decisively. You're getting a demonstration of evolution in real life right now. And once again, the preacher is projecting, because it is creation that only happens in the imagination and never in real life.
They're lying to you, okay? He that formed the eye, shall he not see? Science deals with things we can observe and study and test. You don't observe anything about evolution.
Remember that the preacher has already admitted to microevolution and to speciation by natural selection. So we do observe evolution. We can also study and test it and confirm that it's real and really happening. But no one has ever witnessed creation, not even micro-creation. Nor has anyone ever verified even the slightest essence of anything commonly described as the supernatural. Not one bit of that has any evident potential reality. In fact, whenever the word supernatural is used, I think we can replace that word with the words magic or imaginary, and in either case the sentence would be just as accurate and still mean exactly the same thing as it did before.
If you have something that's designed like an eyeball, it demands a designer.
Wrong again, as always. In fact, in the 1990s, computer simulations encoding evolutionary rules into a population-based metaheuristic optimization algorithm were able to evolve virtual creatures without any notion of bias or desire or even an end goal. Different lines of descendant designs were optimized automatically, purely through preferential selection of the more functional variants according to the rules of population genetics and without any prior assumptions of fitness, even refining and effectively designing themselves through an unconscious practice of trial and error over several generations, developing forms that eventually exceeded the capacity of intelligent designers. So it is possible in a purely natural system to have incidental designs and staggering complexity of emergence without the involvement of any intelligent agent. In fact, the system works better without one.